Okay, good afternoon. Very warm welcome to the Institute for Government, everybody. I'm Nicola Hughes and I'm a research manager here. So we're here today to discuss Ministers Reflect, which is a project that Jen, Peter and myself have been doing over the last few months on ministerial effectiveness and what it takes to be a good minister in office. So today it's going to work like this. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the project, tell you a little bit more about what we've done. Then Jen, who's one of our senior researchers, is going to run through some of our key findings. Then I'm really delighted to have Jeremy Browne and Lord George Young here on the stage, two people who've actually done the job and hopefully can offer us some good insights on what it takes to do it well. We're then going to have a bit of time for discussion, so you can chip in some questions at the end, and we'll be closed by 2 o'clock. Just a couple of brief bits of housekeeping. We are on the record, civil servants beware, so everything is live tweeted. Please use the hashtag Ministers Reflect if you are a tweeter, and this will all be filmed and put on our website afterwards. Okay, so just to give you a little bit more background to the project itself, the Institute has for a long time worked with ministers both directly and doing research into ministerial effectiveness. I suppose because we think that good government relies on good ministers. And it's quite a unique skill set, I think, that you need to be an effective minister. And what we wanted to do after the election in May was to capture the experience of the last 5 years. So what had ministers found worked or didn't work in that time. And we wanted to capture that in their own words and talk to them not about the sort of the political aspects of it, but what made being a good minister and what made being good in government. So we've done over 30 interviews so far. We've spoken at the moment just to the 2010 to 15 cohort, and we've spoken to chief whips, we've spoken to secretaries of state, we've spoken to junior ministers. So there's a huge wealth of information on this archive, lots of stuff. And of course it's a partial view because it's just their opinions. But we are publishing all of these into an online archive. We think that archive will have great value for researchers, for politicians, for civil servants alike. It's a nice kind of oral history capture. And over the coming months, we hope to add more to the archive. This is very much just sort of the start of the project. And it complements other work that we've done on the history of Whitehall and Westminster. We're also considering maybe in the future going a little bit further back to speak to some previous ministers. So that's just a bit about the project, but I'm sure you'll want to hear about the findings. So over to Jen.
Thank you. So I'm just going to give you a flavour of some of the insights contained in the interviews on our Ministers Reflect site. And I'm just going to focus on what ministers said about their experience of entering office, of getting things done and delivering real change on the ground, and the top tips they shared with us on ministerial effectiveness. If you go on the archive, you'll see a wealth of other information. These are sort of themes just focusing on today. So in terms of their experience of entering office, the vast majority of our interviewees were appointed in 2010 and faced a particularly challenging set of circumstances. It was, of course, the first coalition government in 70 years, which meant that posts weren't exactly allocated in quite the way parties had planned. Obviously, manifestos were also translated into the coalition agreement, which led to some initial confusion about what that meant for the future policy priorities that had been developed in opposition. As Mark put it, it took some time to refocus on what they were actually supposed to deliver in government. In the context of a tough austerity agenda, in those early days, weeks and months of being in office, ministers also had to make some quite tough judgment calls on how to allocate spending cuts. So Hugh Robertson, who was the former Olympics minister, for instance, remembered that on his very first day in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, he went into the Secretary of State's office and sat down with the ministerial team, and they went through a list of 40 projects that were due to be funded with a red pen, one by one, knowing they could only keep about 5. Obviously, for some ministers who hadn't even shadowed their brief in opposition, those sort of judgment calls were particularly tough when they weren't that familiar with some of the department's activities. And finally, there was, after 13 years of Labour governments, there was little collective knowledge on what being a minister was like. You had obviously some familiar faces, Ken Clarke, some Andrew Mitchell, who had had junior ministerial roles, but the vast majority of MPs hadn't served in government before. In terms of their feelings towards their preparation for the role, I mean, it's always difficult to prepare for the realities of office, everything from the avalanche of work that hits you on your first day to the reality of being scrutinised on a round-the-clock basis. But some ministers did feel far better placed than others. Their previous experience, when it comes as a big surprise, was key to that. And we found there were sort of three key variables that came through from the interviews. One was whether ministers had worked in a large organisation before coming into politics. And particularly in instances where they had run large organisations, they felt really quite comfortable with a departmental role. Secondly, whether ministers had any previous experience of working in departments. So we did speak to some who had been civil servants and had worked with ministers and had a good understanding of what that role entailed and saw some good role models. Obviously others had been junior ministers under the Heath, Thatcher and major governments, and again were more familiar with that role. And finally, the sort of third variable was whether they had shadowed their ministerial brief in opposition. As Chris Hughes put it, if you were to get thrown into any complex departmental area without having some previous period of absorbing the issues, you're at an enormous disadvantage. And many spoke to us about the challenges of getting up to speed on sort of complex subject matter. In terms of the actual induction period itself, experiences were similarly varied. Many found the appointment process a little chaotic. That ranged everything from Lord McNally finding out about his appointment on Sky News about 10 minutes before he actually received the phone call to confirm it was true. Others who, even after the phone call with David Cameron or Nick Clegg, were still none the wiser as to precisely what their role was or their ministerial brief. And there were others, so Bob Neal, Joe Swinson, who physically couldn't get access to their departments for one and in some cases several days because the necessary paperwork hadn't been completed. So sort of after these initial teething problems, most people found their private offices were their main source of induction support. So as a pensions minister, Steve Webb, pointed out, he was very honest, they didn't have a clue how government and civil service worked, and it was really his private office that gave the necessary briefings and the practical and emotional support that he needed in terms of hitting the ground running. And finally, when we asked ministers whether they thought there should be more formal induction, mentoring and training, their views were quite mixed. So everything from Andrew Mitchell, who saw any more formalised process as being another tier of bureaucracy that wouldn't be suitably personalised for individual ministers, to others such as Damien Green, who felt that politicians actually would benefit from a much more professionalised approach to induction and continuing development. And that was certainly echoed in interviews we did with ministers who were new to government altogether. So moving on to the experience of actually getting things done. Obviously, for the first priority for most ministers was establishing an effective daily routine. The first few months in office, they were acutely aware those first 100 days that we often hear quoted in the media were critical for them, sort of establishing credibility, setting the right tone, getting key relationships forged. Again, the private offices were quite crucial in that, but ministers did emphasise to us the real need to assert control over their diaries, that habit of diary secretaries to schedule never-ending conveyor belt of meetings. And if they really wanted to focus on priorities, they needed some thinking time and space to engage with the right people. They also felt the real need to invest early in giving very clear directions to civil servants and how they wanted information presented to them. Departments often had quite established ways of working, but they really wanted them to adapt to their particular working style. But ministers also highlighted a number of obstacles that they faced in the early days to setting an effective routine. One of the big ones we heard was high civil service turnover. So some ministers went into office to find almost their entire private office had disappeared, and within a couple of weeks they were the most experienced person around them. They also found within the department more widely some key positions were left vacant when they came into office, and that particularly where they faced crises in the early days and months, they really felt unsupported. So Caroline Spellman, reflecting on her experience of the Forest sell-off fiasco, said, "We were without a permanent secretary, a head of news and a director of communications throughout the whole period, and that was really hard." And so she's quite critical of the lack of succession planning that we sometimes see in the civil service. And her comments are by no means isolated. You'll see other examples of that on the archive. A second issue, an obstacle that ministers highlighted, was the lack of understanding of Parliament among civil servants. Now, they very much conceded that within Parliament there's often a lack of understanding of civil service processes and machinery, but they were somewhat surprised at the lack of technical knowledge of how Parliament works, even within parliamentary units within departments. And some went to extra lengths to do briefing sessions for civil servants to try and build up that understanding. They also highlighted the lack of political awareness sometimes, so a lot of the briefings that they received as preparation for debates in Parliament lacked of political astuteness. In terms of delivering results over their whole term in office, we asked ministers what was particularly helpful. We heard that establishing and communicating clear priorities was essential to hitting the ground running, that civil servants needed a clear steer, and once they had that, they were remarkably adept at delivering for ministers. But ministers did also concede that it was important to stress test many of these policy priorities and enable effective challenge. So particularly in those early days and weeks when trusted relations with the civil service had yet to be forged, that challenge wasn't always forthcoming. So giving really explicit permission to civil servants that they welcome challenge, but also, as Steve Webb commented, going outside and finding external challenge, whether that was through going to conferences, establishing working groups with external stakeholders. Tim Loughton also really emphasised how he benefited from setting up groups of service users, for example, children in care, and getting that feedback and challenge on his policy ideas and as the policy went forward to be implemented. And we also heard from ministers recognise the need to proactively engage the centre. Now that ranged everything from David Willetts's observations that he was able to help protect the science budget by having good relationship with the Treasury, independently of the negotiations that were going on with his department and the Treasury. We also heard a lot of people reflect on relationships with Number 10 and how they would have benefited from keeping Number 10 informed much earlier, particularly in controversial policy areas. As George Young pointed out, let Number 10 know if something's going wrong. They don't like being caught on the hop. And you're much more likely, many ministers reflected, the ones that did have policies that blew up on them later down the road, that had they have had the backing of Number 10 earlier on, the chances are they'd have had their back when things went wrong. We also asked about the key relationships in terms of delivering on the ground, as well as the private office. A number of other ones stood out. Firstly, the need for a well-functioning ministerial team. And most ministers characterised that as one where Secretaries of State saw themselves as a team leader, maintained constant dialogue, particularly through face-to-face meetings. We heard stories of sometimes when ministerial teams very rarely met, and it certainly wasn't a positive in terms of getting results on the ground. And also Secretaries of State who are willing to delegate responsibility on the basis of earned authority. And as Alan Duncan put it, a good Secretary of State will bring out the best of their ministers and enjoy their success. A poor one will be a control freak who sometimes hogs everything for themselves. And we certainly saw from the interviews that junior ministers could be a real asset in delivering key policies, providing they demonstrated and established enough trust, because ultimately they had more time to oversee implementation than Secretaries of State had. The other key relationship that many ministers brought up was special advisors. And on both sides of the coalition, they were very honest in how sceptical they were about the value of special advisors coming into office, and how they did a real U-turn, having experience working alongside them. And many felt, particularly junior ministers, that they would have benefited from having them. As Vince Cable said, I was a bit sceptical of special advisors, but having been in government, they're absolutely essential. They acted as an interface with the political parties, with other government departments, and with your political opposite number. Now, it's not to say that you won't find on our archive examples where ministers actually found particular special advisors blocked access to Secretaries of State or created a more corrosive atmosphere. But overwhelmingly, the general response we had was that they added hugely to the support system and delivery. So I'm just going to leave you now with the top tips that ministers gave us on how to be effective in office. So we specifically asked them the question of what advice you would give to a new minister coming into office for the first time. And we collated those results from the interviews that we've conducted so far. And overwhelmingly, number one was that need to have a clear set of priorities that are effectively communicated and relentlessly pursued. So Simon Hughes points out, knowing your priorities, having enough control over your own agenda to be able to pursue them, and making sure then they don't get hijacked by others. Secondly was the need to invest in relationships with parliamentary colleagues. And one of the greatest regrets ministers shared with us was that they didn't feel they spent enough time in Parliament communicating with their colleagues, letting them know what they were doing, and they felt that ultimately that was sort of detrimental to the development of their career in the longer term. You know, as Mark Hoban reflected, I probably spent less time doing that than I should have done. Another element of that was people felt that they should have invested more time in preparing for debates, putting time into parliamentary questions, so making a good impression amongst their colleagues. Thirdly, people were very honest. You know, the reality of today's media scrutiny is that your public image matters. As Mark Priss put it, you have to push other things out of the way to spend enough time with the media, whether we like it or not. That's part of the process. You know, people need to know what you're doing. And number 4 was the advice that you take advice from your predecessors. So it's everything from George Young's comments about finding out where the bodies are buried to who key stakeholders are that you should be engaging with. And as Jo Swinson put it, you really shouldn't be afraid of whatever party affiliation your predecessors have. So she received lots of support from Labour, former Labour ministers who were very willing and open to share advice with her. And number 5 was take staff engagement and people management seriously. So many ministers will get quite distracted for understandable reasons by flagship policy priorities or media work or the many other sort of competing demands on their time. But recognising that civil servants are some of the most valuable assets to delivering on your policies, and that staff engagement, staff morale within departments needs to be taken seriously. And finally, the need to stay on top of your brief. So as Lord Howe put it, you've got to have the mind of a barrister or a super journalist, being able to leap from issue to issue and keep a lot of facts and figures in your heads and things and see things coming. So that continual ability to perform both in the media, Parliament, and answer questions when your brief is constantly changing was something that new ministers needed to be aware of.
Great, thank you, Jen. So I want to come to Jeremy Browne first. Jeremy was a Liberal Democrat member for Taunton Deane for 10 years, from 2005 to 15. I think he held a number of posts in opposition on Home Affairs Select Committee and so on, and then in 2010 was made a Minister of State at the Foreign Office, where you seem to have covered pretty much half the world as far as I can tell. We've got sort of Southeast Asia, South America, and a load more, and then moved on to the Home Office in 2012 to be Minister for Crime Prevention. So, Jeremy, what are your thoughts on this, particularly as sort of coming in as a new minister in 2010?
Thank you, by the way, for the presentation. Hello, everybody. I think this was probably, in part, a feature of it being coalition. So it's very hard for people to plan in advance, although I have no experience of coming into government any other time. But my first-hand experience was it was almost endearingly chaotic. And I'd gone back to my constituency in Taunton because I started the week in a very marginal seat. So I was thinking by the weekend whether I'd be an MP, let alone whether I'd be a government minister. And then we went straight, and Chris Hughes is in the front row, but he was right at the centre of all of this. I was relatively peripheral. I was one of the 57 Lib Dem MPs. But we were involved in this sort of rolling process of trying to see if we'd be in government and on what terms. And I eventually got back to my constituency where my house had been abandoned. Anyone who's fought an election, you know, the grass is about that high in your back garden. And I went into Tesco's to buy some milk because I'd run out. And I was looking at the front page of all the papers, which had David Cameron and Nick Clegg on the front in the Downing Street garden. And my phone rang, and I answered the phone, and it was the Downing Street switchboard. It says, Deputy Prime Minister, I'd like to speak to you. It took me quite a while to work out that it wasn't John Prescott or whatever, whoever it was. Anyway, it was Nick Clegg. And I thought, I can't speak to him in Taunton Tesco, so I went out into the car park. And he said, I'd like you to be a minister in the Foreign Office. And I said, fantastic, thank you. Congratulations, by the way, on becoming Deputy Prime Minister. And I said, out of curiosity, will I be a Minister of State or Under Secretary of State? And he didn't appear to know there was a distinction between the two. Which matters a lot to us junior ministers, but maybe not to Deputy Prime Ministers. And I said, never, I'm sure this will be resolved. And I said, what will my responsibilities be? And he didn't seem to have the faintest idea what they would be either. In fact, and so I rang my mother. I went back and got some milk because I still wanted to have a cup of tea. And then I rang my mum. Anyway, and then about half an hour later, private office rang me up and they said, Minister, congratulations, very Foreign Office. Minister. We're all awaiting your arrival. And I said, I'm standing in the garden at home in Taunton talking to my mum. But I'll come and see you tomorrow. So that's what it was like. So it was, and when I got to the department, I mean, I had responsibility primarily for our relations with Asia and Latin America. So all the bits of the world where progress is being made and where Britain pays virtually no attention to. And that was only by a sort of process of default, really. I had a good private secretary who managed to swap overseas territories with Asia, which I thought was... that was a good swap, wasn't it? And I got to keep the Falkland Islands, which was the one overseas territory you're probably most interested in keeping. So I lost Ascension Island and the Pitcairns, and I came to China and Japan and South Asia. But it wasn't due to an amazingly elaborate process of design. So that was my initial experience. And I suspect it probably, to a degree, echoed by lots of other people. It's also interesting, when I went to the Home Office a couple of years later, it wasn't that much better, actually. And I said there were so Minister of State in the Home Office, that would be... well, I much preferred being a Foreign Office Minister, Home Office Minister, and I was better at being a Foreign Office Minister, Home Office Minister, so I recognise that. But I did say when I was appointed, there are traditionally two main Minister of State jobs in the Home Office, Police Minister and Immigration Minister. I'm assuming Theresa May is not enthusiastic about having a Lib Dem as Immigration Minister. Does that mean I'll be a Police Minister? And no one seemed to know. So anyway, I turned up in the department and found I was neither of those. No one really quite knew what I was going to do. Anyway. So I think there is scope for quite a lot more. I mean, it is a bit of an issue actually. Not since John Major really have we had a senior member of the government who's actually been a junior minister. So perhaps it is a little bit of a product of people not understanding the tiers of government below the very top level. And I'm sort of halfway on the sort of HRification of ministerial appointments. I mean, one of the things quite nice to be a politician is you don't have to be subjected to 360-degree appraisals and all that sort of corporate, which is just so awful. On the other hand, I did turn up and I had a private office of 5 people, and I said, I don't want to be rude, but I haven't got the faintest idea what any of you do, and I'm sure it's all hugely important. But will you go round the table and tell me what you do and just explain the basic mechanics of a ministerial office? And actually, the Foreign Office is very good. They're very good at authoritative, content briefing. Probably not so good at sort of modern HR practice. But I came to find it quite easy to work with them very quickly. But I started from a complete standing start. That's a very long answer. It was fine.
Great. Okay, that's really useful, thank you. So I want to come on now to George Young, Lord Young of Cookham, who has been in and around politics for a while. First came into Parliament in, she said politely, in 1974 as MP for Ealing Acton, then was in the representative for North West Hampshire until 2015. And George had been a minister in the Thatcher years and the Major years, including in health, in housing and the Treasury. And of course in the last Parliament was Leader of the House of Commons and Chief Whip. So what's your sort of perspective on all of this, more from sort of sitting at the centre and in the House?
Well, congratulations on producing this very important archive. I think the first thing I'd say is there are lessons here for the civil service as well as for ministers. Some of the stories we heard about the chaos when people arrived, there are lessons there for the civil service. I think the second thing to say is in the last Parliament, I was a usual channel, a business manager, either Leader of the House or Chief Whip. Therefore, I have a slightly different perspective in that those jobs are very different from running a departmental ministry. On the other hand, what the Chief Whip is doing is judging ministers who have got the right skills. So when it comes to reshuffle, you can identify for the Prime Minister who are the ones who are struggling a bit. And also you're looking at your backbenchers to see which are the ones who've got the necessary skills to manage a portfolio. I had a sort of similar experience to Jeremy. When we formed the coalition, the Prime Minister called me in and said, George, I want you to be Leader of the House of Commons and Lord Privy Seal. I said, that's fine. Both of which had always been cabinet jobs. And about an hour later, there was a phone call. Frightfully sorry, we've miscounted. You can only have, was it 22 cabinet ministers? And because of the Lib Dems, we're one over the top. So, George, would you frightfully mind being... would you frightfully mind being a Minister of State? Well, there's not really any other answer to that than, of course I don't mind. And so there was that confusion within the Cabinet Office. And anyone here from the Cabinet Office who was keeping the score as the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister appointed folk to the job. One of the things I'd say is ministerial skills are not static. You kindly said I've been around a long time. When I became a minister in 1979, there were hardly any SPADs. There was no Westminster Hall. Parliament wasn't televised. There were no select committees. There was no social media. So the skills you needed as a minister then are very different to the ones you need now. And I said that just to make the point that what you're doing should not be static, in that looking ahead, the portfolio of skills a minister may need may change as the society in which we work changes. And also, I think different prime ministers have different styles, and therefore the skills that a minister may need may change with the prime minister. For example, Gordon Browne had a very different style of government to Tony Blair. Phone calls in the very small hours of the morning from Gordon was not Tony's style. So again, I think that is one of the variables that you need to fill in. There are some core skills. You've simply got to understand public expenditure. That you've got to follow very closely the bilaterals with the Treasury, understand what's above the line, what's below the line, whether it's real, whether it's cash, all the rest, whether you can get some of it scored as a PFI. You've really got to be up to speed with the intricacies of your departmental budget. It used to happen every year, now it happens every Parliament. So you still need those skills, absolutely crucial. As we've heard, you've got to be on top of your brief. You've really got to be up to speed and have, if not in your mind, at least in your wallet, the key facts and figures relative to your department. Managing the diary. Nothing should go into the diary without the minister approving it. None of these automatic, well, the Secretary of State has always done this annual dinner, therefore we've put it in the diary. Yeah, you've got to keep a very close grip on that. And also make sure you've got enough space for the constituency and the family. It's important that the family shouldn't pay too heavy a price for ministerial commitment. On career development, ideally, and it's not always possible, a minister should have spent some time in the Whip's office and some time in the Treasury. Now, obviously, you can't do it. But time in the Whip's office in the House of Commons is invaluable in seeing how the place runs, getting to know the business managers, getting to know all your colleagues. And also some time in the Treasury. The Treasury, I was going to say the Treasury runs the government. Obviously different chancellors have different styles, but if you're in the Treasury, you get a very good bird's eye view of what's going on in the whole of the government, and also understand the mentality and culture of the Treasury, which is slightly different from other departments. So ideally, a minister, if possible, should spend some time on the way through. Then cabinet subcommittees. You've really got to take those seriously. Round the table will be some of the sort of sharpest operators in Whitehall. And one minister came to PBL, Parliamentary Business and Legislation, trying to persuade us that this was a seriously important bill. And actually, he was not up to speed. He did not know the details. He couldn't answer the questions. And so that bill was dropped from the programme. And a lot of the serious work takes place in cabinet subcommittees. And there you've really got to be up to speed. And what you don't want to do is read out your departmental brief. Obviously, you've got to know what it is, but the best thing is, by all means, have notes. But what you want to do is talk to your colleagues in your own words and explain why this particular measure is important, or indeed, if it's in cabinet, why your view is one that should prevail. But the moment people start reading out the departmental brief, I'm afraid a lot of colleagues just switch off, and it's very important that you get on top of that. We've got a much more assertive House of Lords. I think ministers have really got to, and some members here, they've really got to pay more attention than certainly when I first became a minister to the House of Lords. I think we're losing, is it 70–80% of the votes at the moment in the House of Lords? And so a minister, whether or not he's a Lords minister, has got to have a strategy for managing the Lords, keeping back some of the concessions for the Lords, not doing them all in the Commons to safeguard the legislative programme. Special advisors, there are many more. The special advisor who stays in my mind is Nick Hardwick, who at the time we appointed him was working for Centrepoint. And rough sleeping was a real issue, and so Nick became a special advisor, and he had no history of ever working with my party. I never asked him how he votes. He's now HM Inspector of Prison. But it was fantastic having someone like that who really understood rough sleeping from the point of view of the voluntary organisations, working for 2 years with ministers, helping to develop a policy. So one shouldn't always go for spads who have shown loyalty to your particular party. You should think laterally and get people who really know their subject, who have credibility in the area, and try and persuade them to work for the government, even if it's not a government who shares their affiliation. And finally, no surprises. Absolutely right. The last thing Number 10 want to hear is that court case, which the departmental lawyers told you was 90%, 99% certain that the Supreme Court would find on, and then blame me down. You're told that a particular judge, who they hadn't expected, took the case. And so you always tell Number 10 if something might go wrong, even if it doesn't. They don't like to be, as you said, taken by surprise. So those are some sort of footnotes to this fantastic archive that you've been working on over the past few months.
Excellent top tips for any budding politicians in the room. Jeremy, if I could just come to you quickly on this. George was talking there about Parliament, and it came out in Jen's presentation as well, both in terms of getting bills through, keeping the Lords on side, but also as a politician and a minister, how did you create time to both spend time with your colleagues in Parliament and keep up the links with your constituency?
Well, happily, actually, what I was prompted by George to say is pretty much an answer to the question you just asked, which is that from the outside, even as an MP in my first term, certainly before I became an MP, I always saw sort of government reshuffles, or the government, as different people who are all part of the same organisation. It was only really when I moved from being a Foreign Office Minister to a Home Office Minister, I realised that you were moving from one to a completely different organisation. It wasn't even like you were going from being a lawyer in one law company to a lawyer in another law company. It was like going from being a lawyer to doing a completely different job that had nothing to do with law. So apart from, in fact, the Parliament was the only really common link. Not as different building, different issues, different culture. And in Foreign Office, even the sort of more superficial things like it's an older, grander building with lots of big oil paintings on the wall, whereas the Home Office is a new building. It's a big difference between having a Secretary of State whose leadership ambitions are in the past and one whose leadership ambitions are in the future, if you are a subordinate minister in a different political party from that Secretary of State. There's a big difference in terms of the Foreign Office was not, apart from Europe, which is quite a politicised issue, obviously, although maybe a bit less. Quite often the problems on Europe in the government were between different wings of the Conservative Party rather than between the two parties in the coalition. But apart from that, the Foreign Office is not, most of the time, a hugely political department, whereas the Home Office has this sort of permanent siege mentality that success is getting to the end of the week without being blamed for something, is pretty much the mindset. The Foreign Office was run through the ministerial team. The Home Office was largely run through the special advisors in my time in the two departments. Home Office is very legislation heavy. It's probably about a third of all government legislation is coming out of the Home Office. So you're in committee the whole time, which I didn't particularly relish, and doing lots of sort of small, detailed legislative changes. Whereas the Foreign Office hardly does any legislation at all. In my whole 2.5 years as the Foreign Office Minister, I didn't go to a single House of Commons committee. Well, I hardly ever went to the House of Commons. And I travelled a lot, whereas in the Home Office I hardly travelled at all. The clue is in the name of the department, the Foreign Office and the Home Office. And as a result, my relationship with the constituency was much easier to manage, because the Home Office I was sort of came up on Monday morning, I went back on Thursday evening. Whereas the Foreign Office I was often away, because I'd covered the other side of the world. I normally went away for a week at a time, weekend to weekend, so I'd have void constituency Fridays and how I made those up and so on and so forth. So, and then finally, they were culturally different, like going from an Oxbridge senior common room to a local council in cultural terms. So that the Foreign Office did not have trade union notices above the photocopier urging you to go on strike against the ministers you were notionally meant to be serving. Which I suppose there are different people who approach these things differently. On the other hand, the Foreign Office were much more sort of nervous about anything that sounded too political. So when I was on any questions or something, the Foreign Office insisted that I had the briefings for those, even though the briefings were being done with officials from Number 10 in Portcullis House, because it would touch upon party political issues, and they thought the ministerial code of conduct, whatever it was, meant that I ought not to be having those party political conversations in the department. Whereas when I went to the Home Office and said, oh, do I need to go over to Portcullis House for this briefing, they looked at me like I was mad, because they are sort of immersed in sort of political firefighting and hand-to-hand combat on a sort of day-to-day basis, and they then across their mind it's even very political to appear on one of these programmes. So it was just a sort of huge contrast between the two departments. And the reason I say that is because there's an idea that you'd be a good minister or not. And frustratingly, I thought I was getting better at being a Home Office minister, just at the point where I ceased to be one. But it is perfectly possible to be a very good minister in one department and a not very good minister in another department, because your skills fit the culture of one department and not another. There's no particular reason why somebody's very good in culture, media and sport should go to the MOD and be just as good at that. And yet there's a sort of sense that that person has the sort of necessary aptitude to be a minister. And I wonder sometimes at senior levels whether there is sufficient consideration given to which people have the right skills for which department, and whether there's much regard to whether the people feel they could make a better contribution in one area than another.
Do you want to come in on that? Because you were saying about talking to the Prime Minister around reshuffle times and so on.
I think Jerry has a good point in that ideally you want round pegs in round holes. But then you've got all sorts of other imperatives. The Prime Minister has a target of X% women in cabinet and in ministerial jobs. You've got to have a balance between north and south. And all those other considerations impinge on the round pegs in round holes. And the Prime Minister or the Chancellor may feel that certain members on the backbenches should be on the front benches, and then you have to accommodate them to get them in the team. So although in an ideal world you'd talk to the backbenchers, which are the subjects you're interested in, which select committees are you on, which public bills have you served on, what is your constituency and what interest you have there. Oh, that looks, we'll put you in the Department of Health. You may start off with that, but actually it gets distorted as the process of the reshuffle or the initial appointment goes through, and you find you're deviated. Ideally, you ought to talk to the Secretary of State before you make the appointments to his junior team. And he's going to have to work with these folk. I'm not sure that happens. In fact, at times...
Not with Norman Baker and Theresa May, it didn't.
Yes. You're right, but politics imposes itself on what would be sensible appointments.
And how much, when you were thinking about sort of promotions, and you mentioned sort of light touch appraisal, if you like, of ministers, how were you thinking then about what made them a good minister? Was it how well they were doing in the House, or how well they were doing in media? Was it talking to departments?
Well, I think it's no secret that all the Whip's office do appraisals of all members of Parliament, including ministers, and they take it really seriously. There's a whip on every public bill committee. There's always a whip on the bench in the House of Commons, and each whip looks after 12 and 15 colleagues. So from all those perspectives, you get quite a good idea of who has which qualities, and some rule themselves out, made it absolutely clear they don't want to be ministers, and that's fine. When I first got into the House, there were lots of backbenchers who did not want to be ministers. They were far too busy doing something else. Whereas now, most of them want to be ministers. So there is appraisal. It's not as sophisticated as it ought to be. The HR function of supporting colleagues who are going through bad times needs to be beefed up, which is almost a sort of separate subject on its own. But the Whips do talent spotting, and also once they're there, if a minister is struggling in Public Bill Committee, then come the next reshuffle, that minister may well find that they're not doing that job anymore.
So I want to open out to the audience now. In particular, we're lucky to have a few extra former ministers here today. So if I could get the microphones down, just start with John Healey, who was a minister in the Labour years, and if you've got a different perspective going a bit further back on any of this stuff.
Okay. Thank you, John Healey. First of all, hats off to IFG for doing this project. Ministers Reflect is one of the things that ministers very, very rarely do, especially during their period of office, and too often not rigorously enough afterwards as well. And also second, because in the debate about more effective government and civil service reform, the role of politicians is often overlooked, and I think this fills a gap. It was one of the reasons when Nick Herbert, the Conservative MP for Arundel and South Downs, and I set up jointly a new think tank, Govern Up, a couple of years ago. One of our 6 projects was like this, on the role of politicians. Secondly, it's always chaos, appointments and reshuffles. It happened to me as well. I was first rung up by Tony Blair, invited to join the government. He said he wanted me to be the first ever adult skills minister. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to say, well, thank you, Tony, that's very good. Do you have any particular priorities for this role? And that completely nonplussed him. First of all, he hadn't given it a moment's thought, and he said, well, don't worry, Stephen will talk to you about that. And of course, he'd overlooked the fact that he'd appointed Stephen Byers not to the Secretary of State for Department for Education and Skills at that point, but an hour earlier had switched him to DTI, and it was Estelle Morris, who was the Secretary of State, the opposite happened to one of my good friends and colleagues who was a junior minister, to Tom McNally, who you said found out about his appointment 10 minutes after it was on Sky News. This friend of mine found that he'd lost his job simply because he'd been completely overlooked. He wasn't on anybody's list. So the reshuffle was complete. Nobody had called him. And when he actually put his hand up and tried to find out what had happened, there wasn't a job for him. So he lost his job completely by default. So there's always an element of mend and make do. One thing that I hope's in the interviews, and certainly if you're going to develop this further, I think I'd like to see a bit more, and we've touched on it a bit in discussion here, how the reflections of and the role of politicians link to some of the sort of major themes of more effective government and challenges for the civil service. So the power and role of the centre, proper and clear accountabilities, the difficulties often in dealing with cross-departmental programmes and projects, and sometimes the frustration of departmental silos, as Jeremy's quite vividly described to us. So that's one point. The second is that, certainly in my experience and the work that Nick Herbert and I did, it was very often voiced as a frustration of ministers and ex-ministers that the administrative regime tended to neuter the special contribution often that politicians could bring to the operation of government. George, you mentioned the cabinet subcommittees. It's true that a lot of the clearance and consensus or agreed positions come through that work, but I found those very often the most frustrating, the least productive part of doing my job. And it was partly what you said. People would come with their departmental brief, and they'd come as their departmental delegate. They'd have their sort of wins and objectives for that meeting, and there was very little sort of flexibility and often serious decision taking. And actually the occasions that it worked were exceptional, and tell us something, I think, about features of doing things better. One forum was an ad hoc forum rather than a standing committee, and it was of regional ministers, all of whom also had a departmental brief as well. So they came to those meetings not with a departmental brief, but with the experience of their region, which they swapped, shared, and was very stimulating and useful to colleagues, and often arrived at collective views of other parts of government and the way they needed to respond. The second example was a one-off subcommittee that I led when I was, topically enough, the Minister for Floods Recovery in 2007. And it was just junior ministers, but what made that effective was, first of all, we had a single task rather than being part of a process, and we had very much the authority of the Prime Minister, who realised his head was on the block if we didn't do the job, in order to force our departments and other parts of Whitehall to respond in the way that was needed and quickly enough. So there are lessons, I think, of what worked as well as what didn't work in our experience. And then finally, my top tip, I think, would be stimulated really by Mark Hoban's comment, but it would be not about relations with parliamentary colleagues, but relations with my colleagues in government. And I think too often ministers become part of the administrative regime. They lose sight of what they bring that is special and distinctive as politicians. And a lot of the best work that I was involved in government was laid because the politicians talk directly to each other rather than mediated necessarily always through the departments. And finally, I hope you're going to extend the archive at some point to some of the Labour former ministers, and I hope in time it might be useful to us in the future as well.
I'll ask Jen to come and the panel to come back on some of those points, but first of all, I just want to check if either Chris Huhn or Hugh Robertson, who are two of our other interviewees, had any responses to that or anything else to chip in. Get the microphone.
Thanks. I mean, my one thought is just to reiterate, I think, something that I said to you, which is that government is quite different to other big organisations in the sense that it has multiple objectives. And therefore, the definition of what is effective government is quite hard. And I think John's absolutely right. You ideally need to have all your colleagues on board for those objectives at any given time. But don't underestimate the distinct possibility that those objectives may change. And indeed, they may change without anybody necessarily telling you that they're changing. And don't necessarily assume that because you have been given a job and told to get on with it as effectively as possible, and another department, for example the Treasury, has been given another set of objectives, i.e. get the deficit down, that those two things are necessarily going to be terribly easy to reconcile. And, you know, a classic example of this was actually in the last government. I don't know, Caroline I don't think is here, but Caroline Spellman did exactly what Number 10 wanted when it came to forestry policy. And then some months later, when the wind had changed and public opinion had gone in the other direction, she suddenly found herself carrying the can for what was seen as a dud policy and actually had to resign. So be careful. Are we defining effective as being in favour of whatever Downing Street happens to think? Is it what Downing Street happens to think now? Or does Downing Street have one of those little Goldman Sachs disclaimers at the bottom of their investment advice, which says these are our present opinions and our present opinions only and are liable to change at any moment? So ministers have to watch out.
Great. And Hugh, did you want to come?
I suspect most of it's probably already been said. And actually, I was really chuckling listening to Jeremy because my experience of moving to the Foreign Office in 2013 was unearily similar to his in 2010. And actually, particularly Mark going from a small department, my DCMS, to a large and very grand one. I mean, culturally, they couldn't have been more different. And actually, both had unique strengths. I think the two things I would say is, if you ask me what had really worked well in the sort of 5 odd years I did it, having a Secretary of State who is absolutely crystal clear about what their priorities are made a huge difference. And when we started in 2010, the Secretary of State I was working for at the time had 5 things that he wanted to achieve, and actually he was able to gear the department up around about them. Secondly, I absolutely share Jeremy's analysis of the joys of working for William Hague in a man who's just interested in being a thoroughly good Foreign Secretary, not everything else. One of the things that really impressed me about him was the discipline he showed in making sure that every single submission that came to him had first been through a junior minister. And that not only translated a feeling of huge confidence in the junior ministers, but also meant that policy was properly developed and had been thought about by the time it got to him. And it meant that, you know, the clever civil servants couldn't cut the junior ministers out of the loop. And it was, you know, I thought it was a really effective thing to do.
And William Hague, if you are by any chance watching, would really like to interview you for Wave 2. So, does anybody want to come back on any of those?
I maybe just pick up on the cross-government working issues that obviously came up in interviews quite a bit. And not particularly sort of complimentary stories that we received. Many found actually within the department, ministerial teams quite often worked fairly harmoniously, regardless of the political party that ministers were from. And sometimes those ties were much, much stronger than even colleagues from the same party within other departments. So I think that was a theme that came up, and actually many found themselves, particularly on the Lib Dem side, sort of accusations of having gone native, things within their departments. And I think some reflected that perhaps a little more time spent in Parliament could have helped. But experiences of joint ministers were also quite mixed in how well that worked. Cabinet subcommittees, again, there's quite mixed experiences. So not a huge amount of solutions offered, other than people who highlighted things like troubled families initiatives, certain ways of looking at policy very differently, so framed around the needs of a service user may have helped sort of drive change, but some of the existing systems to help with government, cross-government working, perhaps are not working as they should.
So we'll open up now more widely to the floor. If you have any questions, please put your hand up and wait for a microphone to come to you. It would be really helpful if you could tell us who you are, and if you want to direct your question to anyone particularly on the panel, let us know. So we go here first. And then my director is raising his hand at the back, so I think I should probably oblige that. So then up to Peter.
Thank you. Simon Boyden. I hesitate to acknowledge that I'm from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, but I certainly won't, given that we're on the record, I certainly won't comment on what former ministers have said, except to recognise perhaps the accuracy of their sentiments. I was going to ask, perhaps in particular of those former Foreign Office ministers, but of others too, whether we had anything to learn from other governments overseas. And I'm thinking in particular of my own experience in Germany for most of the period of the coalition, where of course coalition government is the norm. But there are a couple of significant differences. Not suggesting that it's better or worse, but their ministerial or departmental teams tended to be of a single party, with some advantages and disadvantages. Secondly, each department would have both a parliamentary with parliamentary ministers. I mean, the Secretary of State would be a member of Parliament, but junior ministers would either be parliamentary or officials. And the parliamentary ministers would manage the relationship with the Bundestag, and the civil servant ministers or officials would manage the department. So I mean, those aren't necessarily the only or the best examples, but I'd be interested in their views.
Great. And Peter.
Yeah, I'm Peter Riddle, director and the third partner in the interviews, the silent one. Just to add a couple of things. One, as Jen just said, we looked, for example, at joint ministers, but also the archive has interesting evidence on, I might say, quite abstruse subjects, but quite important ones. For example, a point which hasn't been reflected is Lords ministers. We've got the experience of 2 trade ministers in there, and again, building up Lords ministers' experience, which is wholly different from Commons ministers. Also, the law officers. By chance, there was a bit of a turnover of law officers for various reasons, and that is reflected. And of course, their perspective is totally different on that. I just want to make a couple of brief points. One, to reassure John Healey, we are. And he's already volunteered to be the first interviewee, I noticed, to try and broaden and deepen the archive there. And this is, of course, in parallel to a project which it's already doing called the Whitehall History Project, which goes up to 2010. And so we've got a lot of complementarity there. And so we do want to broaden the experience of the evidence. The other point I wanted to make was in relation to, and it's been touched on by both George and Jeremy, is preparation for office and also what happens in office. Because also reflecting our other work, it's too often, as George says, someone mucks up a committee and out they go next time. And as he well knows from being chief whip and over the years, often the first thing a minister who's about to be sacked discovers is when they get the phone call on the night. And there really isn't sufficient support during the period. You can talk to your colleagues, but ministers are alone. And one of the things we felt here is not only as we've done, and Nicola's been running it, a ministerial induction sessions with new ministers, very successfully, but also the need for that to carry on while people are in office, because things change during their office, and actually the ability of ministers to talk to each other and be offered support, even the dread 360-degree, Jeremy, which we've done with a number of ministers here in total confidence, actually helps people. And one shouldn't ignore that. It's not just at the start, but during the period. And it may avoid the ghastly phone call when the last person to discover they made a complete mess of it is the person about to be sacked.
So, Jeremy, do you want to start with that question about what you might have learned from other governments, having seen quite a few around the world in your job?
I will. Can I touch on the other two very briefly?
Yep.
I wish I had a blinding anecdote. I suppose the only way that not to learn is my record for the number of people sitting in a meeting, a bilateral meeting, taking notes of what I said. all of the contenders for this are in Japan. 13 is my record. So we do government more efficiently than some. I don't know what the other 12 were comparing notes with, but I wasn't saying anything sufficiently profound to require that many people to take an archive. So you do see different sort of culture. They mainly reflect the cultures of different countries, but I'm sure we can learn. Although I think a lot of, we spend a lot of time considering how we can make government better, and I think there are a lot of virtues within our system. I'm not personally of the view that if there is another coalition government, we should do it so that the junior partner owns a small number of departments and is excluded from all the other departments. I think it sounds neat in theory. I think in practice, were the Lib Dems, for example, to have had exclusive ownership of the departments we had Secretary of States in, including Chris's, but had no representation in the other departments, we would still have been obliged to vote through the policies in all of the other departments where we didn't have anybody in those departments at all. So I don't think we would have remained unsullied by some of the decisions that Conservatives were taking. And then my brief other point, Lord Howell was the Lords Minister in the Foreign Office when I was there, and he was a huge asset actually to have he had been the youngest cabinet minister when he was appointed in Margaret Thatcher's government. The added benefit of being the father-in-law of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, but he was a knowledgeable, wise figure who had stretched over many decades in Whitehall, and I think added to the overall competence of the ministerial team. My final point is Chris's one about how do you measure effectiveness? What constitutes effectiveness? And this is a particular sort of Lib Dem point, which is that I felt in the last few years of the last government that the Lib Dem ministers were encouraged to a greater and greater degree as the Parliament wore on to measure their effectiveness by whether they could carve out a sort of micro niche for themselves within the department, separate from what the Conservatives would otherwise have done in that department had the Lib Dems not been present. And that is a measure of effectiveness. Here is some cause that we have advanced and might otherwise not have been advanced, and there's no doubt a pressure group or somebody who thinks that it's great that more attention has been given to this cause. What made me nervous about that was that I thought that we were busy disowning the government that we were a part of and which the British public were keen to re-elect, and I thought that was electorally extremely unwise approach to take. But I got the sense more and more that was the template that was being used for ministerial effectiveness. I thought the most effective government would be the one that achieved objectives which were in the national interest, and that both parties in the government may be rewarded for pursuing those interests with vigour. But different people have quite different views about what constitutes effectiveness, and same people have changing views about what constitutes effectiveness.
And George, Peter was talking there about you touched on it earlier, sort of lack of support for ministers once they're in post. Do you want to expand on that a bit?
Well, just to pick up Jeremy's, I think what you did was right for the coalition government, but possibly wrong for your party. The way you loyally defended what it was doing as a whole without emphasising the contribution of the Lib Dems. Just to pick up one or 2 points. Peter's point, the law officers are different, Lords ministers are different, and the business managers, the whips, are different. What training is there to be a whip? None. Then other governments. What I noticed, I was in Greece once representing the Thatcher government. I had to come back for a vote, and the other ministers just could not understand what was going on. Many of them were not MPs, or if they were MPs, they were in some great coalition, and they couldn't understand why the British delegate suddenly disappeared. Probably happened to you once or twice. And an in-house training, I'm sure you're right, but it's a question of shoehorning into a fairly busy ministerial schedule the broader training for other ministerial jobs. So it's right, but you have to find the time to do it. And I take your point about there's a reshuffle, and suddenly you're doing the adjournment the next day, or you're in public bill committee. And I think the answer, the whip's answer, will any member of Parliament who's worth his salt ought to have some idea of what bills are going through Parliament, what are the tricky issues, and they ought to have some sort of background information as to what he might what he might be doing. Then you asked me a specific question at the end.
It was about that point about support, so that's fine.
Right, marvellous.
Jen, do you want to come in on anything?
Just on the support issue, as well as the sort of more formal support that could be available, whether there's demand for that or not, And the one sort of plea we did hear from a number of ministers in the interviews was support from the party for U-turns, that an effective minister, when things are going wrong, sort of is brave enough to recognise that early enough and take necessary action, that often they feel very pressurised to continue too far down the road. And you know, some sort of Steve Webb reflecting, there was a bizarre position where the department instructed him he had to keep, so in terms of public dialogue, knowing they were going to take a U-turn on a particular policy, but the public position until they were ready to announce that was he had to keep defending that position and promoting it, even though he knew it was going to change completely. So that's a change in attitude towards U-turns. Obviously, there's pressure from the media, and that's not always particularly practical, but that was another bit of support that people highlighted they needed.
I'll take a couple more questions. I've got one at the front here and then Susan at the back.
Thank you. Andrew Kahn, a governor here, but also I was head of UK Trade and Investment. Just a point of fact, I don't think it's fair on the Cabinet Office to blame them for the chaos of reshuffles and appointments. It's the number 10 machine which does it, with 1 or 2 bits of advice from the Cabinet Office. Blame number 10. It's always the best thing to do. I wanted just to ask you about what were known by Gordon Browne as the GOATs, the government of all the talents, the external people who come in to be ministers from business, sometimes from the social society or from the military, as Lord West did. I see that you've talked to Stephen Green. Digby Jones, another one, said that being a minister was the most dehumanising experience he ever had. I just wondered whether you got any particular insights from people who hadn't been politicians, whether they were more effective, they felt they were more effective, or not. And lastly, can I just make the comment, Jeremy said that there were different jobs, different types of being a minister because of departments. Also, simply what you have to do. So, for example, some ministers have to go and negotiate in Brussels, and that's a particular skill. Other ministers find themselves focused entirely on Parliament, others on actually having to go out into the community here in the UK. And I think that differentiation of what effectiveness means really is something you could try and define and distill in your future work.
Great. And back.
Yes, I put my hand up because I was a Lords Minister for the last 18 months of the coalition. I was a minister in the Department for Transport. And I do think this issue that's been raised, it's very different being a Lords Minister, because in the Lords, the government never has a majority. And in order to get legislation through, you have to be able to take the House with you. And that means building a relationship of respect with members of the opposition and the crossbenchers who have expertise in the area that you're addressing. And I do think it is very high risk to pick people and bring them in who have no experience and no love of working in that kind of environment, who see themselves as a specialist minister in the department to work on a particular topic, but regarding their role in the House of Lords as essentially just, reading the brief that gets handed to them for either questions or a debate. And if you do that, you lose legislation, you lose votes, and you lose them regularly. And it seems to me that's never been taken on board by much of the government. And my other question was around, I don't know if people agree with that, but my other question was around challenge. I mean, one of the things I found so interesting about being part of a coalition was that because there was always a mixed set of ministers, usually only one Liberal Democrat in the department, but it created a natural challenge around issues and around policies. And I think as a consequence, in a far less controversial and dramatic way, actually led to better policy. But I'd just be interested in other people's thoughts around that and what you do for challenge today.
Great. Okay. Jen, do you want to start off with this question around Lords ministers and some of the particular challenges for those? Because we did speak to a few.
Yes, so you'll find quite a number, I think, from Lord McNally, Stephen Green, who's been discussed. There are plenty of others on the archive. And we did hear there were a few sort of trends that came up. One was they tended to be more comfortable with the departmental role than the House of Lords. That was a completely foreign, alien environment to them. When we sort of mentioned that ministers were sometimes surprised how little civil service understood about Parliament, that was particularly true of the House of Lords in terms of protocol. So even getting advice within the department about how to handle situations in the House of Lords wasn't always forthcoming. So I think that was where they themselves sort of put the emphasis on the challenge was in the Lords, and also obviously having to, rather than just have the brief that they were doing within the department, have to answer questions across the entire sort of departmental portfolio. So the demands on their time in the Lords were a lot more than their counterparts in the House of Commons. I think that's already the sort of key themes that came out.
Any additions to that?
Just pick up one point, excuse me. Policy making during the coalition was much more robust than under one-party government, because one-party government, you just had to get the policy through the Tories. With the coalition, making policy within the government was a much more laborious process because you had two parties, and therefore what emerged from that was it avoided the sort of dangerous dogs, those sorts of bills that were produced in a sort of, in a rush under one-party government. So there was that particular advantage. But Susan, you're right. Navigation in the House of Lords is totally different to navigation in the House of Commons.
I just want to pick up a few. One was what Sir Hugh made, which is lack of understanding in departments about how Parliament works. I did find that quite a strong feature. There was a lot of respect, even reverence for Parliament within the Foreign Office, but quite a lack of understanding about Parliament. So there'd be a sense that they had to engage with Parliament because that was a good thing to do. But the engagement with Parliament would be, so we've put in your diary an opportunity for you to meet in one of those pokey little rooms off Westminster Hall. They didn't describe it like that, but you know the rooms, the W. So you can give feedback about your recent trip to Latin America. And I'd say, who do you envisage coming to this meeting? And they say, well, we don't know, but it's all gone in the whips, the party whip. The only person who ever came along was Jeremy Corbyn. Normally to tell me how brilliantly the government was doing in Venezuela. But anyway, we had very convivial chats. Those were in the days when I was a politician called Jeremy with greater prospects than him, but everything changes quickly in politics. Whereas when I went to the Home Office, actually they were much more sensitive to because they are sort of permanently in sort of political mode. So it was a big change between the two departments. Second one, Andrew's point about different skills. It's definitely my experience that even within the Foreign Office, different ministers have different skills. So for example, if you're the minister who does, there's a minister who does Middle East and North Africa. Okay, he's got Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, Egypt, Israel, Palestine. You have to have a certain level of patience. Yes, I'm not like. And all my time there was Alistair Burt, who was perfect for the role because he's an extremely patient, quietly spoken man. Whereas if you're a Europe minister and you're negotiating people in Europe, that's a slightly different. Mine were. It was almost a quasi sort of trade role with sort of growing economies in Asia and Latin America. It was quite a sort of different set of skills as well. So even within a single department, it's worth giving thought to I think the people at the top of government think, shall we find somebody who's suited that department if they think that? But even within the department, some thought could be given that. And the final observation I'd make was, I think coalition governments in future, the stress and strain in my experience was how a department adapted to coalition. And it was very easy in my experience in the Foreign Office because it was a harmonious department. It wasn't particularly political. The Secretary of State was a very inclusive figure, the way Hughes described. And I said to him at the beginning, I said, my objective is to try and make sure that we are regarded as the most successful department in government. And in so much I'm able to contribute to this, that you're regarded as the most successful Secretary of State department. I want to be a team player. I don't want to be a fly in the ointment. Whereas when I went to the Home Office, I think it was envisaged by a Deputy Prime Minister that I would be a fly in the ointment. It's quite a different role to be sent to a department to try and make life more difficult for the Secretary of State. And there was almost unbridgeable chasm, I'm afraid to say, between the Deputy Prime Minister and the Home Secretary, and trying to serve them both, as I was sort of required to do to a degree, because I was sitting in the ministerial team meetings, and Home Secretary was my Secretary of State, and I was leading on legislation in committees, which was legislation that she had signed off and she wanted to be approved and had gone through all the government machinery. And it's very hard to know whether you were being measured on how well you were making the government department work or how badly you were making it. So I lurched from one to the other and was removed after a year. So It is. I only say that because I think there are the particular features of coalition that make that we can probably learn from in future, and particularly the role of the junior coalition partner and how they interact with the dominant party.
We are rapidly running out of time, but maybe we've got time for just one more quick question. I'm particularly keen to hear from any women or anybody who's in the overflow room next door who's feeling left out and would like to ask a question. Okay, there's no women, so we're going to go over there.
I'm not sure whether to be pleased that I'm asked to speak after you can't find a woman. It's a very unusual experience. I'm Robert Morland. I'm a former member of the European Parliament and local councillor. And the question I was going to ask, which hasn't been highlighted, to me, very often I've had the comment that the real effective minister is the one who rides the crisis, who gets a crisis, is able to face up to it and get it through and not swallowed by it, or is able to know when to back out when it's a bridge too far. Dare I suggest, for example, the current budget has examples of that. And the only other point I would make, which George has made, but it actually is important as regards civil servants, is the diary. I think I've had more complaints from ministers about that over the years, including lots of complaints about how they've been sent to a luncheon at the Carlton Club, and at the last moment the civil servants have said, could you leave 15 minutes later because you've got a meeting? One actually told me he actually left an hour late because he was told by his civil servants that the meeting was with Robert Maxwell.
Great. Jeremy, do you want to take the diary question? Because diaries occupied a lot of our ministers' energies and time. We found it was sort of quite an important thing to get the diary right.
Yeah, I don't know why. I mean, yes, I don't know why I didn't need it occupy more time than that. I mean, I think the difficult. I always, when I was an MP, we had our illustrative. I did it the whole year round, but a sort of Christmas lunch with all the people who work for my MP's office. I'm going to miss it. The first decade of Christmas lunches. I won't do it this year. But when I became a minister, we had the Christmas lunch with everyone, and my ministerial team all came down to my constituency. We went to a village pub, and the reason I say it is because weirdly, it needs to be an integrated whole, I think, and that's just illustrative of my point. Otherwise, people only sort of see one dimension of you, and they need to understand that what they are doing potentially has a sort of knock-on effect. You can't just tell the person in the constituency, oh, sorry, it's a void Friday next week because there's X, Y, and Z. Because there's loads of engagements in the constituency you've agreed to months earlier, and it's extremely ill-mannered to your constituents to pull out at short notice. So I don't know if it's necessarily particularly difficult. I think you need to have a reasonable grasp on it, do it the way that suits you. But I think you need to have all of the different parts of your life, including your private life, all sort of in harmony and factored in, so that you have a diary that actually bears relation to reality rather than just one component part of reality, which is the responsibility of that individual person.
And George, just very quickly on crisis management, any examples where you've seen it done very well or very badly?
The really good one, of course, will have avoided the crisis by seeing it. But you're right, it's managing the House of Commons on a UQ when you're on a really sticky wicket. And it's maintaining some morale with your junior team when the department's going through a bumpy time. And if something's gone wrong, the best thing to do is to admit that it's gone wrong, rather than to try and sort of smother everyone with a sort of smoke screen. But there are people who've gone through difficult times and survived. And William had a difficult time when he was leader of the House right at the end. I've forgotten what the crisis was. something to do with managing the parliamentary timetable. And it might have sunk other people. William actually handled it really well. And at sort of 2:30, I remember what it was. But yeah, you've got to be tough. Can I just mention one thing which you haven't touched on at all? Ministers are human. Ministers can face deselection by their constituency parties. They're affected by boundary changes. Their marriages can come unstuck. They may have financial problems. They may have health problems. And we haven't sort of talked about that at all. I don't want to talk about it now, but actually it is an issue. So the HR side of managing ministers, particularly when they have a bumpy time, which is something which is ignored, and many ministers have paid the price for it.
Great. We're going to have to wrap things up now. Just quickly, the archive is is publicly available and there for everyone to explore at your leisure. Jen's just going to quickly show you how the website works, which is on the Institute for Government homepage if you go there.
Absolutely. So you're able to search the archives by sort of keyword, but also by position, department, whether it's House of Commons or House of Lords ministers, and also by political party. You can read those interviews on screen, and there's also a download button where you can view those interviews as a PDF as well.
So do have an explore. They are tremendously interesting, and thank you to our partners at Soapbox who built the website. We had huge fun doing them. I hope you'll have huge fun reading them. So finally then, just a huge thank you to all of our interviewees throughout this and to our fantastic panellists, and thank you for coming.